The house was too quiet for its size. At the edge of the city, behind tall iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges, it sat like a monument to wealth, cold, still, and heavy with silence. The floors were polished until they shone like water, the walls lined with art that cost more than most people's homes, yet something about it felt empty. No laughter echoed through the hallways, no footsteps hurried across the marble. Only the soft hum of machines in one upstairs room broke the stillness, reminding anyone who listened too closely that the man who lived there was not free. He was trapped inside his own body, paralyzed from the neck down, left with nothing but his mind, his voice, and his money. Outside those gates, the world was completely different. The streets were loud, cracked, and crowded. Children ran barefoot along the sidewalks, stray dogs darted between cars, and the smell of fried food mixed with dust hung in the air. It was there, not far from the mansion, that a young girl lived in a cramped two-room apartment with her mother. Their walls were thin, their windows rattled whenever a bus passed by, and most nights dinner was nothing more than bread dipped in watered-down soup. She was small, thinner than she should have been for her age, and her clothes always carried the look of being worn too many times. Yet in her eyes there was something sharp and watchful, a kind of hunger that wasn't just for food. The two worlds should never have touched, but somehow they did. At first it seemed almost like fate, the way one life folded into another. The poor girl stepping into the orbit of the paralyzed millionaire. On the surface, it looked like a story people wanted to believe. An innocent girl with nothing to her name and a man who had everything but freedom. He, once powerful and feared in business, now bound to a chair, his muscles useless, his wealth the only thing keeping his world running. She, with nothing but her stubborn will and a strange kind of belief that sometimes slipped into her words when she wasn't thinking. In the beginning, it was all appearances. She would sit quietly in the kitchen, watching the staff move in and out, learning who had power and who pretended to. He would listen from upstairs, his bed angled just enough toward the window that he could watch the world pass by while never being able to touch it. The staff spoke of him in whispers, calling him strict, impossible, and at times cruel. They said the accident that left him this way was punishment, though no one dared to say for what. And yet, when the girl entered his life, she didn't carry the fear or the awe the others did. She spoke to him differently. She didn't see the chair or the machines first. She saw his eyes, sharp and restless, like he was still fighting to stay in control of something he no longer owned. Still, even in those early days, there was something uneasy about the air between them. She would make small remarks, innocent enough on the surface, but they seemed to dig under his skin. One day, when she saw the glass of thick juice a nurse set beside him, she told him not to drink it. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Stop drinking that juice," she said, almost as if it were an order. "You'll heal." The nurse laughed it off, the way adults do when children say strange things. But the man's eyes lingered on her, a flicker of something passing through them, annoyance, curiosity, or maybe fear. Before the crime, before everything came undone, life in that house carried on in a way that looked normal, but never truly was. The millionaire's days were measured by routines, meals prepared at exact times, exercises that moved his lifeless body, endless medical visits that all ended the same way, with no progress. The girl's life, by contrast, was messy and unpredictable, filled with small humiliations, small victories, and a growing sense that she didn't belong anywhere. When their paths crossed more often, people began to whisper. Some said she brought light into the house, that she made him laugh in ways he hadn't in years. Others said she was dangerous, that she had no right to speak to him the way she did. What no one wanted to admit was that there was a kind of power shifting between them. He still had his money, his control over the staff, and his sharp tongue that could cut someone down with a single word. But she carried something different, something none of them could name. When she spoke, sometimes he listened. When she looked at him, sometimes he looked away. And underneath it all was an unspoken tension, a sense that their connection was pulling both of them towards something none of them was ready to face. It was in those fragile days, before the crime that would stain everything, that the house began to feel heavier. The walls seemed closer, the silence deeper. She kept coming back, slipping into his world as if she belonged there. And he let her. That was the first crack in the perfect mask of wealth and order. A poor girl who told a paralyzed millionaire not to drink his juice, because somehow she believed he could heal. The girl's presence in the mansion grew harder to ignore. At first she lingered in corners, her thin frame easy to overlook as staff rushed about with trays and schedules. But soon she became part of the daily rhythm, her voice sly, peeping into the silence of the rooms like it belonged there. What began as small conversations by the bedside stretched into longer talks, ones that drew the paralyzed man into her orbit, even when he tried to resist. He had grown used to people agreeing with him, obeying him, or avoiding him altogether. She did none of those things. She argued. She questioned. She laughed at him in a way that made him feel both furious and alive. One afternoon, the tension between them revealed itself for the first time in a way that no one could mistake. She walked in while the nurse was feeding him, pressing a glass of that same juice to his lips. He swallowed reluctantly, eyes darting toward the girl. She stood still, arms crossed, her voice sharper this time. "I told you not to drink it." The nurse chuckled nervously, telling her to mind her business, but the man surprised them both. He refused the next sip, his lips clamped shut, his eyes never leaving the girl's. The nurse muttered under her breath, frustrated, but eventually gave up and left. When they were alone, the man whispered, "Why do you say that?" She only shrugged, as if she didn't need to explain. That moment, small as it seemed, shifted something in him. He had defied his nurse for the first time in years, and it was because of her. The staff noticed changes quickly. He became impatient with them, dismissive, snapping more often. But with her, he was different. He let her stay even when he sent the others away. This bred whispers in the kitchen, bitterness that thickened into suspicion. Some said she was manipulating him, feeding him strange ideas. Others said he was becoming obsessed, finding in her something he had lost: control. Whatever it was, the staff grew hostile, treating the girl like an intruder. They hid food from her, shut doors in her face, and once, one of the maids grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. But the girl, stubborn and unshaken, told him everything. That was when the tension spread beyond just two people. It infected the entire house. Outside the mansion, her life grew harder too. Her mother's health was failing, their landlord was threatening eviction, and the little money she scraped together vanished as quickly as it came. At night she lay awake, torn between guilt for spending so much time at the mansion and the undeniable pull to return there. It wasn't just about the food or the warmth of the rooms. It was about him. Something about watching his eyes follow her. Something about knowing her words mattered more to him than the expensive doctors or the staff paid to care for him gave her a strange sense of power she had never known. For him, that power was dangerous. He started demanding she visit, insisting the staff bring her upstairs. He began rejecting meals unless she approved, dismissing physical therapists if she wasn't there to watch. His wealth had always given him control, but now it was the girl's presence that dictated the flow of his day. His family, who rarely visited, began to notice. A brother came once, walking through the halls with the arrogance of someone who thought money made him immune to rot. He saw the girl, frowning at the way she lured hers, injured by the man's bed. "She doesn't belong here," the brother muttered. But the paralyzed man, voice hoarse but sharp, told him to leave her alone. That was the first time he had defended anyone so openly in years. The girl saw it, and something inside her tightened, a mix of gratitude and something darker, something that tasted like victory. But with victory came obsession. She began to imagine herself in that mansion, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. She noticed the jewelry his family left lying around, the closets filled with clothes she could never afford. She noticed, too, how quickly his gaze softened when she entered the room, how his voice grew stronger when he spoke to her. A seed planted itself in her mind, that she could change everything, not just for him, but for herself. She told herself it was about helping him heal, about giving him back what he had lost. But in quiet moments, she admitted it was about her too, about escaping the life of hunger and cold nights. The mansion itself seemed to respond to their growing bond. Lights flickered in the hallways, doors slammed harder than they should have, and the silence grew oppressive. Every interaction carried heat. The staff began watching her with open resentment. One maid accused her of stealing after a bracelet went missing. She swore she hadn't touched it, but the accusation spread like fire. The man, furious, ordered the maid out of his sight. His loyalty to the girl was clear, and that loyalty fractured the thin order of the house. Past wounds began to rise. The man's accident, whispered about but never explained fully, came into focus. Rumors said it wasn't an accident at all, that he had made enemies, that his fall from power was less about fate and more about revenge. The girl listened to these stories carefully, storing them away. If his wealth came from cruelty, she wondered, did he deserve her pity or her help? And yet, whenever he looked at her, when his voice softened into something almost vulnerable, she couldn't pull away. Her mother noticed changes in him too. The girl grew distant, her eyes sharper, her words shorter. "That house is changing you," her mother warned one night, coughing into her blanket. But the girl didn't listen. The mansion called to her more than home ever did. Jealousy flared one evening when a new nurse arrived, younger and confident, speaking to the millionaire with familiarity. The girl watched his eyes linger on the nurse, and something hot and unfamiliar surged in her chest. Later, when she was alone with him, she snapped, "You like her, don't you?" He looked at her with confusion, then anger. "Don't be foolish," he rasped. But she didn't forget. That jealousy, raw and sharp, became another crack in the fragile bond between them, feeding into the tangled mix of dependency, resentment, and unspoken desires. It was clear to anyone watching that the story was pushing towards something that could not be undone. The staff whispered louder, the brother returned with threats, and the girl became more daring, her words sharper, her presence heavier. He clung to her, but she was no longer the quiet, wide-eyed child who slipped in unnoticed. She had become something else, confident, demanding, dangerous. And beneath it all, the glass of juice remained. Every time it was placed by his side, she watched it with an intensity that unsettled everyone. He began refusing it completely, and though no one understood why, the reason was always her. That drink, that warning, became a symbol of their connection and their unraveling, a small detail that carried the weight of everything building in the shadows. The mansion felt like a cage with its bars tightening, every moment stretching toward a breaking point. The girl's hunger for more, the man's dependence on her, the staff's growing hatred and the family's interference all wove together into a knot that could only snap violently. No one could stop it. The path was already set. The night of the crime was heavy with a kind of silence that felt unnatural. The air inside the mansion was thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The staff had gone quiet hours earlier, their footsteps fading, their voices muted. Even the machines in his room seemed to hum more softly, as though they knew what was coming. The girl sat by his bed, her eyes fixed on the glass of juice resting on the tray beside him. The same glass she had warned him about so many times before. Her small hand twitched against her lap, restless, as though her body knew before her mind that tonight would not end like the others. He watched her closely. His body was useless, but his eyes, sharp, restless, never left her. For weeks, he had felt himself losing control, first over his staff, then over his brother, and finally over her. She was no longer the timid child he had first allowed into his home. She was fire, unpredictable and demanding, and he needed her in a way that made him hate himself. He could feel it twisting inside him, the humiliation of depending on her for his dignity, his will to live. That dependency curdled into resentment, even as it pulled him closer to her. The tension had been building for days. His brother had stormed through the halls earlier, shouting that the girl had no right to be there, threatening to cut her off, to send her back to the streets where she belonged. The man, furious but powerless, had ordered his brother out. She had been there for all of it, her dark eyes gleaming, her lips pressed into a line that betrayed more pride than fear. For the first time she had seen how far he would go to protect her, but protection came with a cost, and she knew it. That night, something inside her cracked. Her mother's sickness was worse than ever, bills piling up, eviction looming. And here she sat, in a room surrounded by wealth that meant nothing to her, beside a man who could give her everything but refused to let go of control. She told herself she cared for him, that she wanted him to heal. But deeper inside, another voice whispered that he was her cage, as much as her salvation. When the glass of juice was set down again, the moment finally came. She leaned forward, her voice soft but edged with steel. "I told you not to drink that," she said again, slower this time. He smirked, a cruel twist of his mouth, and rasped, "And what if I want to?" His words were a challenge, a reminder that no matter how much she thought she had power, he was still the master of this house. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with fury. She reached for the glass, her fingers tightening around it. He barked out a sharp sound, half laugh, half cough, and told her to put it back. His eyes gleamed with something dark, daring her. In that moment, everything between them, power, obsession, resentment, collided. She didn't put it back. Instead, she held it out to him, her voice shaking now, louder, harsher. "If you want it, then take it." His lips parted, a retort ready, but she pressed the glass hard against them. Liquid spilled down his chin as he choked, sputtered, and tried to resist. The machines beeped wildly, the room filling with chaos. His eyes widened in shock, then terror, as the juice slid down his throat. His body convulsed weakly, powerless against her strength. The sound of his choking filled the air, raw and animal-like, each gasp more desperate than the last. She pressed harder, her face twisted in rage and tears, until at last his head slumped sideways, the beeping slowing into a flat, piercing tone that cut through the silence like a knife. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at what she had done. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor, juice spreading across the tiles like blood. Her chest heaved, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had imagined this moment in whispers, in fleeting thoughts she never admitted to herself. But the reality was louder, heavier, suffocating. His lifeless eyes still stared at her, wide open, accusing even in death. Her mind raced. Panic surged through her body, cold and hot at the same time. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair, her breath coming in sharp gasps. For a second, she thought of running, fleeing the mansion before anyone found her. But another thought rooted her to the spot. If she left, they would know. The staff already hated her. They would point to her, accuse her. She had no alibi, no shield. She moved quickly, wiping her hands on her dress, pulling the blanket over his chest as though tucking him in for sleep. She pressed buttons on the machine, silencing the alarm. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of finality, heavy and unbroken. Still, she couldn't stop staring at him. Part of her wanted to scream, to shake him awake, to undo what she had done. Another part of her, darker, quieter, felt a rush of something that terrified her. Relief. The man who had loomed over her, who had pulled her into his orbit and bound her there with chains of dependence, was gone. She was free, and yet not free at all. Downstairs, the staff moved about, unaware. But they would come. They always did. The sound of her own breathing filled the room, too loud, too wild. She pressed her fists against her mouth to muffle the sobs that tore out of her whole body shaking. She had crossed the line she could never step back from. When at last footsteps echoed in the hallway, she panicked again. She shoved the glass shards under the bed, wiped the spilled juice with the blanket, and collapsed into the chair, her face buried in her hands, trying to look like a girl who had just witnessed, not caused, tragedy. But deep inside she knew it didn't matter how well she pretended. She would never escape the truth of what she had done. The crime was written on her body, in her trembling hands, in the wildness of her eyes, in the silence of the man who would never speak again. The discovery came faster than she expected. The staff entered his room only minutes after the silence of the machines, their footsteps brisk, their voices clipped with routine. But the moment they saw him slumped against the pillows, eyes frozen in that final wide stare, the room erupted. Shouts filled the air, nurses rushing to the bed, one of them pressing fingers to his neck even though the answer was already clear. The man who once ruled the house, who barked orders from that bed even without moving a muscle, was gone. The air grew frantic, heavy with the smell of spilled juice still clinging to the floor. The girl sat in the chair, her face hidden behind trembling hands. She didn't cry at first. She let her body shake, let her breath come short and sharp, the way they would if she were only frightened, only a witness. But inside, her chest felt hollow, stretched thin by guilt and disbelief. Every second that passed made her more aware of what she had done and how fragile her disguise was. She thought the shards of glass under the bed were glowing, screaming her guilt. She thought every pair of eyes would see through her, would know. When they asked her what happened, her voice was a whisper. He stopped. The words caught in her throat, but they sounded believable. She clutched the blanket, her small body folded into itself, and no one pressed further, not yet. Shock filled the mansion like a fog, drowning reason in grief and confusion. Downstairs the staff split into factions. Some whispered that the girl had cursed him, that from the first day she stepped into the house, nothing had been right. Others insisted he had been dying for years, that it was inevitable, that her presence had nothing to do with it. But every eye eventually landed on her. The poor child who never belonged, who somehow became the center of his world, was now the last person to see him alive. Her mother arrived soon after, dragged by the news that swept through the streets faster than fire. She clutched her daughter to her chest, weeping into her hair, half from grief and half from fear. She knew what others were already thinking. Poor girls did not end up in mansions without reason, and men of power did not fall without someone to blame. The brother came back that same night, rage twisting his face, his voice booming through the house. "She did this," he spat, pointing at the girl as if the accusation itself could bring order back. "She poisoned him, or she drove him to it." The staff nodded, eager to align with his certainty, but the truth was harder to pin down. There was no proof, no witness, no clear evidence, only suspicion, and suspicion was enough to stain. The girl, meanwhile, spiraled quietly inside. Sleep slipped away from her. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw him again. His mouth forced open by her hand, his choking, the way his body sagged in defeat. Guilt gnawed at her, until she almost convinced herself that maybe it wasn't her fault. Maybe he had been dying already. Maybe she had only hurried what was coming. She clung to that thought, desperate for it to save her from drowning. But guilt has sharp teeth, and it bit deeper each day. The city reacted quickly. Newspapers printed his photo on the front page, the paralyzed millionaire who had lived like a king until the end. They painted him as a tragic figure, a man who overcame an accident only to be betrayed by his body. The girl's name wasn't printed at first. She was only mentioned as a young visitor, believed to be close to him. But gossip spread through the streets faster than ink. People pointed at her when she passed, muttering about curses, ambition, and manipulation. Some called her dangerous. Others pitied her, believing she had been trapped in a web too complex for her to understand. The legal storm came next. Doctors examined the body, lawyers circled like vultures, and his brother pushed for an inquiry. Was it natural? Was it foul play? The absence of clear answers dragged the process out, keeping the girl suspended in fear. Each knock at the door made her jump. Each question from the police made her heart race. She rehearsed her story in her head again and again. She was only there, only a witness. She said it until it almost sounded true. Her mother, frail and coughing, clung to her fiercely, whispering that they had to leave the city, that the mansion had cursed them both. But the girl refused. She told herself she wasn't afraid, but deep inside, she couldn't let go. She returned in her mind to the nights in the mansion, the power she had felt when he looked only at her, when her words bent his will. That feeling haunted her as much as the crime itself. She wondered if she had killed him not just out of anger, but out of fear of losing that power forever. The brother, relentless, spoke to the press. He painted her as a manipulative child, someone who wormed her way into the house to control a dying man. His words cut deep into public opinion, and slowly, sympathy turned to suspicion. Reporters lingered outside her apartment. Strangers shouted accusations in the street. Every step she took felt heavy with eyes. But beneath the noise, those who had truly known him, the few who had worked beside him in business, the doctors who had seen his decline, spoke quietly of a man who had been rotting long before she arrived. They said his cruelty had caught up with him, that the mansion had been nothing but a cage long before her small hands touched the glass. In hushed tones, some even suggested that perhaps she had only done what others wished they dared to do. The mansion itself stood in eerie silence after his death. Curtains drawn, staff dismissed. Its grand halls echoed with emptiness. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid looking at it, as though grief clung to the walls. For the girl, that silence became a mirror. She saw herself in it, a reflection of a life that had shifted from survival to destruction. She carried the weight of it in her thin shoulders, in the hollowness of her cheeks, in the way her eyes no longer searched for a future, but only replayed the past. The crime left no one untouched. The brother sharpened his hunger for wealth, using the tragedy to tighten his grip. The staff scattered, some haunted by guilt for not speaking out sooner, others hardened by the belief they had been right about her all along. The city grew restless, torn between sympathy for a poor child and disgust for what she might have done. And the girl, caught in the middle, lived day to day in a haze of guilt, fear, and the faintest flicker of defiance. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the shame and the whispers, she still remembered what it felt like to hold power in her hands, even for a moment. And that memory, dark and dangerous, would never let her go. The story did not end with his death, though for many it should have. The days that followed turned into weeks, and the quiet tragedy in that mansion rippled outward until it consumed lives far beyond its gates. The investigation dragged, head-on, as these things often do, and though there were whispers, suspicions, and accusations, no clear proof ever surfaced. The official word was that the paralyzed millionaire had died of natural causes. His body had been weak for years, his heart frail, his lungs prone to collapse. That explanation satisfied the law, but not the people who wanted someone to blame. The girl lived under that shadow, carrying the weight of her secret like a stone tied to her chest. Outwardly, she returned to her cramped apartment, to her sick mother, to the same streets where she had once been invisible. But she was no longer invisible. Everywhere she went, people stared. Some pitied her, calling her a victim of circumstances she could never escape. Others whispered that she was dangerous, a manipulator, a child who had destroyed a man far more powerful than her. She was treated as both villain and survivor, and she didn't know which role she despised more. Her mother's health declined further, and the girl, though she tried to care for her, was too consumed by her own unraveling mind. Sleep rarely came. When it did, it brought dreams of him gasping, choking, eyes wide with horror. She would wake drenched in sweat, her hands clawing at the sheets, as though she were still holding that glass. Guilt tore at her, but so did something darker. An unshakable memory of the power she had felt in those last moments. The power to decide, to control, to end. It terrified her, and tempted her all at once. The brother, left to manage the estate, basked in his newfound authority. He spoke loudly to the press about family honor, about the dangers of letting strangers into private lives. Behind closed doors, though, he enjoyed the wealth he had always hungered for. The mansion became his domain, stripped of the odd silence that once belonged to his brother. But he could not erase the stain of scandal. Business partners pulled away, wary of the shadows that lingered around the family name. The empire he thought he inherited turned brittle in his hands, and no amount of money silenced the rumors that his brother's death had not been natural at all. For the staff, scattered after the house closed its doors, the memory of those years weighed differently. Some carried shame, knowing they had seen the tension and said nothing. Others hardened themselves, insisting they had been right to mistrust the girl. Their stories, told over and over, shifted in detail, but always circled the same truth. Something unnatural had lived in that mansion in those final months, and it had ended in ruin. The public fascination with the case reflected something deeper about society itself. People wanted to believe in clear lines between victim and villain, innocence and guilt. But this story blurred every line. Was she a poor child manipulated by circumstance, or was she a clever predator who saw weakness and seized it? Was he a tragic figure destroyed by a cruel fate, or a man who once used power so ruthlessly that in the end even a child could bring him down? These questions lingered, never answered fully, because human lives do not fit neatly into roles. In the end, there were no court sentences, no prison bars. The law walked away, leaving behind only whispers. But justice, or something like it, unfolded in other ways. The girl lost her innocence, her chance at peace, her belief in a world that might ever be kind to her. The brother inherited riches but watched them rot in his hands. The community, once fascinated by the spectacle, moved on eventually, but not without remembering. The mansion stood as a symbol of wealth and power, and how fragile both truly are. Looking back, what the story revealed most was not about the crime itself, but about the spaces between people, how power moves, how control corrodes, how desperation reshapes morality. A paralyzed man with everything and a hungry girl with nothing collided in a way that exposed truths many wanted to ignore. That dependence can become its own kind of violence, that the powerless when cornered can become dangerous, and that wealth, no matter how vast, cannot shield anyone from the cracks within their own soul. The tale left no heroes. It left scars instead. on a family stripped of its legacy, on a community eager for judgment but left with questions, and on a girl who would carry both guilt and defiance for the rest of her life. Perhaps the cruelest part of it all was how ordinary it looked from the outside. A man in a bed, a glass of juice, a child at his side. Ordinary until it wasn't. And so the story ends, not with justice neatly served, but with the reminder that human lives rarely follow such clean endings. Power shifts, innocence corrodes, and choices made in moments of fury echo for years. What remains is not just the memory of a crime, but the uncomfortable truth it revealed. That beneath wealth or poverty, strength or weakness, every human heart carries the potential for both cruelty and survival.